The citadel of Accord floated in the endless dark of neutral space. A massive structure built from the combined efforts of 1,000 different species over millions of years. And it served as the heart of galactic civilization. The place where all disputes were settled and all treaties were signed. Ambassador Elena Vance stood at the viewport of her small shuttle as it approached the station, watching the lights of countless ships coming and going like fireflies in the night. And she felt the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on her shoulders. Like a physical force, she was 53 years old, with gray streaks running through her dark hair and lines on her face that spoke of decades spent in difficult negotiations across dozens of worlds. But nothing in her career had prepared her for this moment, for the task that Earth's government had placed in her hands. The Galactic Assembly represented over 4,000 member species, civilizations that had been traveling between stars when humanity was still learning to make fire. And they had called this session to witness what they believed would be humanity's surrender behind her. The shuttle's communication system chimed with an incoming message from Earth, and she turned to read it one final time before deleting it from the system. The message was simple. Do what must be done, and know that every human stands with you. She deleted the message and turned back to the viewport as the shuttle entered the docking bay of the Citadel. Hegemony of Shalvek had issued their demands 3 standard months ago, claiming ownership of 3 human colony worlds based on stellar charts that were supposedly millions of years old. And the Assembly had done nothing to stop them, because that was how things worked in the galaxy. The strong took from the weak, and the weak either surrendered or were destroyed. And humanity had only been a spacefaring species for 200 years, which made them infants in the eyes of races that measured their histories in geological ages. Elena walked through the docking corridor alone, carrying no datapad, no documents, no ceremonial items of any kind. And the alien customs officials who processed her entry stared at her with confusion in their many different eyes. She wore the simple gray uniform of Earth's Unified Defense Forces instead of the elaborate diplomatic robes that were traditional for assembly sessions, and whispers began to spread through the station's communication networks before she had even left the docking area. Volari official, its crystalline body catching the light as it moved, stopped her at the entrance to the main corridor and asked if she had made a mistake with her attire. Elena looked at the creature and said that she had made no mistake, that she was dressed exactly as she intended to be dressed. And then she walked past it without waiting for a response. The corridors of the Citadel were filled with beings of every shape and size imaginable, creatures that floated and crawled and walked and slithered. And they all turned to watch the lone human making her way toward the assembly chamber. Many of them had never seen a human in person before, as humanity's territory was far from the main trade routes and their species was considered too young and too primitive to be worth much attention. But today was different, because today the humans were going to learn their place in the galactic order. And many had come just to witness the spectacle. Elena reached the great doors of the assembly chamber and paused for a moment, taking a deep breath and letting it out slowly. And then she pushed through the doors and walked into the largest room she had ever seen. The chamber was built like an amphitheater, with thousands of seats rising up in tiers around a central speaking platform. And every seat was filled with delegates from across the known galaxy. The noise of countless alien voices speaking in countless alien languages filled the air like the sound of a great ocean. And translation devices worked overtime to convert everything into something that could be understood. Elena walked down the long aisle toward the speaking platform, and the noise began to fade as more and more delegates noticed her arrival. By the time she reached the platform, the chamber had fallen almost completely silent, and 4,000 species watched the lone human with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. The Shalvek delegation occupied a position of honor near the front of the chamber, their reptilian bodies covered in ceremonial armor that gleamed under the artificial lights. And their hierarchan sat at the center of them like a king on his throne. He was massive, nearly 3 meters tall, with scales the color of dried blood and eyes that burned with ancient pride. And when he saw Elena's uniform, he let out a sound that his translator rendered as cruel laughter. The assembly speaker, a being of pure energy contained within a mechanical shell, floated to the center of the platform and called the session to order. Its voice echoed through the chamber as it announced the purpose of the gathering: to witness the resolution of the territorial dispute between the hegemony of Shalvik and the human species known as Homo sapiens. The speaker turned to Elena and asked if the human delegation was prepared to present its response to the hegemony's claims. Elena stepped forward and said that she was prepared, but that she wished to address the assembly directly before giving her response. This was unusual, as diplomatic protocol required responses to be delivered in a specific format with specific language, and the speaker hesitated for several long moments before granting her request. Shalvik Archon made a dismissive gesture and said to his aides that it did not matter what the human said, because the outcome was already determined. Elena heard in through her translator and filed the comment away in her memory, keeping her face perfectly neutral. As she walked to the center of the platform, she looked up at the thousands of alien faces watching her, beings from civilizations that had mastered faster than light travel before her ancestors had discovered agriculture. And she felt no fear. Fear was a luxury she could not afford, not today. Not when the fate of billions of her people rested on what happened in the next few hours. She began to speak, and her voice was calm and clear and carried to every corner of the massive chamber. She thanked the assembly for granting her the opportunity to address them directly, and she thanked the Shalvik hegemony for making their position so clear. And then she said something that made the entire chamber fall into confused silence. She said that before she could respond to the hegemony's claims, she needed to ask the assembly a question, a simple question that she hoped someone could answer. She asked if anyone in the chamber could name a species that had been continuously at war with itself for its entire recorded history. The silence stretched on and on, as delegates looked at each other in confusion, because the question made no sense to them. War was something that happened between species, not within them, and most civilizations had unified early in their development or been uplifted by elder races who taught them the ways of peace. No one answered, and Elena nodded as if this was exactly what she had expected. She said that she was not surprised by their silence, because the concept was foreign to them, but she wanted them to understand something important before she gave her response. She wanted them to understand what humanity was, not what they assumed it to be, not what their databases told them, but what it truly was at its core. The Shalvik Archon called out that this was a waste of time and demanded that the human deliver her surrender. Immediately Elena turned to look at him, and something in her eyes made him fall silent despite himself. She said that he would have his answer soon enough, but first, the assembly needed to hear the truth about the species they were dealing with. She said that humanity had been at war with itself since the first human picked up a rock and used it to kill another human, and that this state of constant conflict had never ended, not once. In over 10,000 years of recorded history, the chamber erupted in murmurs and whispers, and Elena stood in the center of it all, waiting for silence to return. When it did, she smiled, and there was no warmth in that smile at all. She said that she had much more to tell them, and she hoped they were ready to listen. The murmurs in the assembly chamber slowly died down as Elena Vance stood on the central platform, her gray uniform a stark contrast to the elaborate robes and ceremonial garments worn by delegates from across the galaxy. She waited until the silence was complete before she continued speaking, and when she did, her voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of human history. She asked the assembly to imagine something for her, to imagine a species that had developed every weapon in its arsenal, not to fight against alien invaders or cosmic threats, but to fight against itself. She asked them to imagine a species that had invented swords and spears and bows and arrows not to hunt animals but to slaughter other members of its own kind. She asked them to imagine a species that had built walls and castles and fortresses, not to defend against monsters, but to defend against its own brothers and sisters, the Volari delegate. Its crystalline form pulsing with confused light, raised what passed for its hand, and asked why any species would do such things. Elena turned to face the delegate and said that she would answer that question. But first, she needed to paint a clearer picture. She said that humanity's homeworld was a planet called Earth, a small blue sphere orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in an unremarkable corner of an unremarkable galaxy. She said that for most of their existence, humans had no idea that other intelligent life existed in the universe. And so they had focused all of their intelligence and all of their creativity and all of their rage on each other. She described the wars of ancient times, when armies of thousands would meet on open fields and hack each other to pieces with bronze swords until the ground was soaked with blood. She described the development of the bow and arrow, weapons that could kill from a distance, and how this technology spread across the planet and made warfare even more deadly. She described the invention of gunpowder, a chemical mixture that could propel metal projectiles at incredible speeds, and how humans had used this discovery not to celebrate, but to build better weapons for killing each other. The assembly listened in growing horror as Elena walked them through humanity's bloody history, her voice never rising above a calm and measured tone. She described something called the 30 Years' War, a conflict that had killed nearly 8 million humans over religious differences that most species in the assembly could not even understand. She described the conquest of continents, how groups of humans had sailed across oceans to claim lands already inhabited by other humans, and had killed or enslaved everyone they found. She described the development of industry, how humans had built machines that could produce goods faster than ever before, and then had immediately used those same machines to produce weapons faster than ever before. The Shalvik Archon interrupted her with a loud hissing sound that his translator rendered as contemptuous laughter. He said that none of this was impressive, that it only proved that humans were primitive savages who could not control their own violent impulses. Elena looked at him and said that he was correct, that humans were indeed violent, but he was missing the point entirely. She said that the violence was not a flaw in human nature. It was a feature. It was the thing that had driven humanity to develop and grow and adapt faster than any other species in their corner of the galaxy. She returned to her history lesson and described something called the First World War, a conflict that had engulfed most of the planet Earth just over 300 years before the current day. She described trenches that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, ditches dug into the ground where millions of soldiers had lived and fought and died in conditions that would make most species in the hive assembly sick just to imagine. She described poison gas, chemical weapons that burned the lungs and blinded the eyes, and how humans had deployed these weapons against each other without hesitation. She described machines called tanks, armored vehicles designed specifically to crush through defensive lines and kill everyone in their path. She described aircraft, flying machines that humans had invented just years before and had immediately converted into weapons of war. And then she described something that made the entire assembly fall into shocked silence. She described the end of the First World War, and how the peace treaty had been so harsh and so humiliating to one side that it had guaranteed another war would follow. She described the Second World War, a conflict even larger and more destructive than the first, a war that had killed over 70 million humans in just 6 years. A consensus delegate a hive mind species that spoke through multiple bodies at once. Asked how any species could survive such losses, Elena said that was exactly the point she was trying to make. She said that humans did not just survive. They thrived, they rebuilt, they came back stronger every single time. She described the bombs that had fallen on cities, turning buildings to rubble and civilians to ash. She described the systematic murder of millions of humans by other humans, simply because of their religion, or their ethnicity, or their political beliefs. She described the development of nuclear weapons, bombs that could destroy entire cities in a single flash of light, and how humans had used these weapons on each other without a moment of hesitation. The chamber had grown so quiet that Elena could hear the hum of the translation devices working to convert her words into thousands of different languages. She described the decades after the Second World War, when two great powers had pointed thousands of nuclear weapons at each other, and had come within minutes of destroying their entire species multiple times. She described how humans had lived under the shadow of complete annihilation for generations, knowing that at any moment everything they had ever built could be reduced to radioactive ash. And she described how they had kept going anyway, how they had raised children and built cities and dreamed of the stars while living with the constant knowledge that extinction was always just one button press away. The Shalvik Archon rose from his seat and demanded to know what any of this had to do with the territorial dispute at hand. Elena turned to face him, and her eyes were cold and hard like chips of ice. She said that it had everything to do with the dispute, because he needed to understand what he was threatening. She said that when the hegemony had issued its demands for the 3 human colony worlds, Earth's government had conducted a survey of its population. She said that they had asked every adult human a simple question: would they rather surrender peacefully or fight a war they could not win? She paused and let the silence stretch out for several long seconds. Then she said that 94% of humans had voted to fight. The assembly erupted in confused noise as delegates struggled to understand why any species would choose certain destruction over peaceful surrender. The Shalvik Archon called out that this only proved humans were too stupid to know. When they were beaten, Elena smiled that cold smile again and said that perhaps he was right. She said that perhaps humans were stupid, perhaps they were irrational, perhaps they were everything that the civilized species of the galaxy looked down upon. But then she said that she had more to show them, that words alone could not convey what humanity truly was. She requested permission to display a visual presentation for the assembly, and the speaker granted her request. After a brief hesitation, the lights in the chamber dimmed, and a holographic display flickered to life above the central platform. Elena said that she wanted them to see with their own eyes what humans were capable of, and what they would do when pushed into a corner. She said that the galaxy had made a terrible mistake in assuming that humanity's youth meant humanity was weak, and then she began to show them the truth. The holographic display expanded until it filled the entire center of the assembly chamber, casting blue light across the faces of 4,000 species, who watched in complete silence. Lena Vance stood at the edge of the display, her figure outlined against the glow like a shadow against a fire. She said that she would not show them humanity's greatest achievements, not their art or their music or their science, because those things were not relevant to the current situation. Instead, she would show them humanity's greatest skill, the ability to resist, to endure, to make any invader pay in blood for every inch of ground. The first image appeared, a frozen landscape covered in snow and smoke, with ruined buildings stretching to the horizon. She said that this was a place called Stalingrad, a city where humans had fought one of the most brutal battles in their history during the Second World War. She had mentioned earlier, she said that an invading army had surrounded the city with overwhelming force, expecting the defenders to surrender or die quickly. Instead, The defenders had fought for every building, every room, every staircase. The display showed footage recovered from old archives. Grainy images of humans fighting hand-to-hand in the rubble of destroyed buildings, using knives and rocks in bare hands when their ammunition ran out. She said that the battle had lasted for 5 months, and that the defenders had lost over 1 million soldiers and civilians. She said that the invaders had lost nearly as many. She said that in the end, it was the invaders who surrendered, not the defenders. The Shalvik Archon made a dismissive sound and said that this was ancient history with primitive weapons. Elena said that he was right, that the weapons were primitive, but the lesson was eternal. She'd changed the display to show a different scene. A city with narrow streets and old buildings made of brick and stone. She said that this was a place called Warsaw, and that during the same Great War, the inhabitants had risen up against an occupying force that outnumbered them by a factor of 10 to 1. She showed footage of civilians, men and women and children, fighting with homemade weapons against soldiers with tanks and aircraft. She said that they had known from the beginning that they could not win, that victory was impossible. They had fought anyway. The display showed buildings burning, streets filled with rubble, and humans crawling through sewers to launch surprise attacks on enemy patrols. She said that the uprising had lasted for 63 days, and that when it was over, the occupiers had destroyed 90% of the city and killed over 200,000 people. She said that the survivors had been scattered, but they had never stopped fighting, forming resistance groups that had continued to strike at the enemy until the war finally ended. A delegate from a species called the Meridian Collective raised a limb and asked what possible purpose such sacrifice could serve if victory was impossible. Elena turned to look at the delegate, and her voice softened just slightly as she answered. She said that the purpose was not victory. The purpose was cost. She said that every soldier the invaders lost in Warsaw was a soldier who could not fight elsewhere. She said that every day the invaders spent crushing the uprising was a day they could not spend advancing their war. She said that every resource they used to destroy the city was a resource they could not use for anything else. She said that humans had learned long ago that wars were not just won with victories. They were also won by making the enemy bleed. The display shifted again, this time showing a narrow mountain pass with steep cliffs on either side. She said that this was a place called Thermopylae, and the battle there had happened over 2,000 years before the present day. She said that a small force of warriors had held that pass against an army of hundreds of thousands, buying time for their people to prepare their defenses. She said that every single one of those warriors had died, but their sacrifice had changed the course of history. The display continued to shift, showing image after image of human resistance throughout the ages. She showed an island called Malta, where a small garrison had held off a siege for months against a force that should have crushed them in days. She showed a fortress called Masada, where defenders had chosen death rather than surrender to an overwhelming enemy. She showed jungles in Southeast Asia, where poorly equipped fighters had defeated one of the most powerful military forces on their planet through sheer determination and willingness to sacrifice. She showed mountains in Central Asia, where invasion after invasion had failed against people who refused to submit no matter how many times they were defeated. The Shalvik Archon rose from his seat again and shouted that none of this mattered, that human resistance against human invaders was meaningless compared to the power of the hegemony. Elena stopped the display and turned to face him directly. She said that she was glad he had mentioned the hegemony's power, because she wanted to discuss exactly that. She said that according to her information, the hegemony maintained a fleet of approximately 12,000 warships of various classes. The Archon confirmed this with a proud nod, saying that the hegemony was one of the greatest military powers in the known galaxy. Elena said that humanity currently had 416 combat-capable vessels. The Archon laughed and said that this proved his point. That humans were outmatched by a factor of nearly 30 to 1. Elena said that he was correct about the numbers. But she asked him to consider something. Else she asked him what would happen if humanity destroyed even 1% of his fleet in any conflict. The Archon scoffed and said that losing 120 ships would be meaningless to the hegemony. Elena said that was interesting, because she had reviewed the hegemony's military records and had noticed that they had not lost more than 50 ships in any conflict in the past 1,000 years. She said that the hegemony was used to fighting wars where the enemy surrendered after the first battle, where overwhelming force was enough to achieve victory without significant losses. She asked what would happen to the hegemony's reputation if a species as young and weak as humanity managed to destroy hundreds of their ships. She asked what the hegemony's rivals and enemies would think if they saw that the great Shalvik war machine could be hurt by primitives with barely 400 vessels. Archon's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, his expression showed something other than contempt. Elena pressed her advantage and said that she had not yet finished her demonstration. She changed the display to show not historical footage, but current tactical data about human military doctrine. She said that every human warship was designed with one principle in mind: to take as many enemies with it as possible when it was destroyed. She said that human ships carried weapons that most civilized species had banned: planet crackers, star destabilizers, biological agents designed to survive in the vacuum of space. She said that every human ship had deadman switches installed, automatic systems that would launch final attacks even if the entire crew was killed. She said that human captains were trained from the first day of their service that their job was not to survive. It was to make the enemy pay for killing them. The assembly chamber had grown very quiet, and Elena could see expressions of horror and disbelief on faces throughout the crowd. She said that she had one more thing to show them, something that she wanted them to remember when they made their decision about the territorial dispute. The display changed to show a simple image: a human child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, sitting in a classroom with other children. Elena said that this was a standard education facility on one of the colony worlds that the hegemony wanted to claim. She said that the children in that classroom were learning mathematics and science and history, just like children everywhere in the galaxy. But she also said that they were learning something else. She said that every human child on every colony world received training in resistance tactics starting from the age of 6. She said that they learned how to hide, how to fight, how to sabotage, how to make life impossible for any occupying force. She said that if the hegemony took those worlds, they would not be conquering territory. They would be inheriting a nightmare that would never end. The Archon rose one more time and demanded that the assembly silence this human and proceed with the expected surrender. Elena turned to face him, and her voice dropped to something almost like a whisper. She asked if he was ready to hear her official response to the hegemony's demands. The entire assembly leaned forward, waiting for the words that would determine the fate of billions. The assembly chamber was silent as Elena Vance turned to face the Shalvik High Archon directly. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The holographic display still floated above the platform, showing images of human children in their classrooms. A reminder of what the hegemony was threatening to take. Elena dismissed the display with a gesture, and the lights in the chamber slowly returned to normal. She said that the High Archon had asked for humanity's official response to the hegemony's territorial claim. She said that she was prepared to give that response, but first, she wanted to make absolutely certain that he understood what he was asking for. Archon's massive reptilian form rose to its full height, nearly 3 meters of armored scales and ancient pride, and he said that he understood perfectly well. He said that the hegemony was offering humanity a choice: surrender 3 colony worlds peacefully, or face the full might of the greatest military power in the sector. He said that any rational species would choose surrender, because the alternative was annihilation. Lena nodded slowly and said that she appreciated his clarity. Then she asked him a question that made his confident expression falter just slightly. She asked him how many ships he was willing to lose. The Archon said that the question was irrelevant, because humanity did not have the power to threaten the hegemony's fleet in any meaningful way, and said that she disagreed. She said that humanity might not be able to defeat the hegemony in open battle. That much was obvious to anyone who could count, but she said that victory and cost were 2 different things. She began to walk slowly around the platform, a voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. As she spoke, she said that she wanted to describe a scenario for the assembly, a scenario that she had wargamed with human military planners dozens of times over the past 3 months. She said that in this scenario, the hegemony launches its invasion of human space with overwhelming force, exactly as the Archon had threatened. She said that the human fleet, outnumbered 30-1, falls back and refuses to engage in open battle. She said that instead, human ships scatter throughout the sector and begin a campaign of harassment and ambush. She said that every supply convoy is attacked, every undefended outpost is raided, every ship that strays from the main fleet is destroyed. The Archon interrupted to say that the hegemony's fleet could hunt down such raiders with ease. Elena said that perhaps he was right, but she asked him to consider the mathematics. She said that if the hegemony assigned 10 ships to hunt each human raider, that meant 4,000 of his ships would be tied up in hunting duties instead of completing the conquest. She said that meanwhile, the humans would continue to retreat, drawing the invasion deeper and deeper into their territory. She said that every light year the hegemony advanced would stretch their supply lines further. She said that every world they conquered would require a garrison to hold it. She said that the deeper they went, the more vulnerable they would become. The Archon said that this was the desperate talk of a species that knew it was already defeated. Elena smiled and said that he was wrong. She said that she had not yet told him about the part of the plan that would truly concern him. She paused and looked around the chamber, making sure that every delegate was listening. Then she said that humanity had spent the past 50 years preparing for exactly this situation. She said that human intelligence services had been working in secret throughout Shalvik space, planting agents, establishing networks, and preparing for the day when war might come. She said that there were currently over 10,000 human operatives embedded in the hegemony's territory, along with hidden weapons caches, sabotage protocols, and detailed plans for disrupting Shalvik infrastructure. The Archon's scales seemed to pale slightly, and he demanded to know if she was bluffing. Elena said that she was not bluffing, and that he could verify her claims by checking the intelligence reports that his own people would be receiving at this very moment, as if on cue. Several Shalvik aides began frantically checking their communication devices, and Elena could see their expressions changing from doubt to alarm. She said that the moment the hegemony declared war on humanity, those 10,000 operatives would activate. She said that they would begin a systematic campaign of terror and destruction throughout Shalvik space. She said that power stations would fail, supply depots would explode, officials would disappear in the night. She said that the hegemony would find itself fighting a war on 2 fronts, one in human space, where the fleet was deployed, and one in their own territory, where enemies they could not find were striking from the shadows. The assembly erupted in murmurs and whispers, and Elena waited for the noise to die down before continuing. She said that she wanted to be absolutely clear about something. She said that humanity did not expect to win this war. She said that the hegemony was too powerful, too numerous, too advanced for humanity to defeat in any conventional sense, but She said that humanity did not need to win, she only needed to make the war too expensive for the hegemony to continue. She turned back to face the Archon directly and said that she had studied the hegemony's history very carefully. She said that the Shalvek had built their empire through intimidation, through overwhelming force that made resistance seem pointless. She said that they had not fought a truly costly war in over 1,000 years. She asked what would happen to that empire if word spread that a species of primitives, barely out of their planetary nursery, had managed to wound the great hegemony. She asked what the hegemony's subject races would think when they saw that resistance was possible. She asked what the hegemony's rivals would do when they saw that the Shalvek war machine was not invincible after all. The Archon's voice was lower now, less confident, as he said that humanity would be destroyed long before any such damage could be done. Elena said that perhaps he was right, but then she said something that made the entire chamber fall completely silent. She said that humanity had one final card to play, one that she had hoped she would never have to reveal. She said that hidden throughout human space, there were weapons of last resort, weapons that could not be found and could not be stopped. She said that if humanity faced extinction, if the hegemony pushed them to the point where surrender was the only alternative to death, those weapons would activate automatically. She said that they were not pointed at the invasion fleet. She said that they were pointed at the hegemony's homeworlds. She said that humanity had the capability to destroy the Shalvek civilization entirely, even if every human being died in the process. The Archon's voice shook as he said that no species would be insane enough to build such weapons. Elena said that he was probably right about most species, but she reminded him of what she had said at the beginning of her presentation. She reminded him that humanity had lived for generations with thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other, that they had come within minutes of destroying their own species multiple times. She said that compared to that, building a few thousand planet killers and pointing them at an alien empire was almost reasonable. She stepped forward until she was standing directly in front of the Archon, looking up at his massive form without any trace of fear. She said that this was her official response to the hegemony's demands. She said that humanity would not surrender a single world, not a single station, not a single ship. She said that if the hegemony wanted war, humanity was ready. She said that they were all ready, every man, woman, and child. She said that the hegemony could conquer human space, but they would choke on it. She said that they could destroy humanity, but humanity would take them down as well. She asked if that was a trade the Archon was willing to make. She asked if 3 colony worlds were worth the destruction of his entire civilization. The Archon stood frozen, and Elena could see the calculation happening behind his ancient eyes. She waited for his response, knowing that the next few moments would determine the fate of billions of lives on both sides. The assembly chamber erupted into chaos after Elena finished speaking, with delegates shouting in hundreds of different languages and the translation system struggling to keep up with the flood of voices. The Shalvek High Archon stood frozen at his delegation's position, his ancient eyes fixed on the lone human woman who had just threatened to destroy his entire civilization. Elena Vance remained perfectly still at the center of the platform, her hands clasped behind her back in the traditional military posture. Waiting for the storm to pass, the assembly speaker finally managed to restore order by activating a sound-dampening field that silenced every voice in the chamber into the sudden quiet. The speaker announced that the assembly would take an emergency recess to consider the unprecedented situation that had developed. The chamber began to empty as delegates hurried to contact their home governments and process what they had just witnessed. Elena remained on the platform, watching the Shalvek delegation closely. She could see the Archon's aides clustering around him, showing him data on their portable displays. And she could see his expression growing darker with each new piece of information. Her people had timed everything perfectly. The intelligence confirmations, the activation signals, the evidence of human preparations were all arriving exactly when they would have the most impact within an hour. The corridors of the Citadel were filled with frantic activity as word spread about what had happened in the assembly. The Volari consensus requested an emergency meeting with the human delegation, which Elena politely declined. The Meridian Collective sent a formal offer of mediation, which Elena acknowledged but did not accept. A dozen other major powers began reaching out through diplomatic channels, all of them suddenly very interested in avoiding being caught in the crossfire of a war between the hegemony and humanity. Elena waited in a small observation room near the assembly chamber. Watching ships come and go from the Citadel's docking bays, her shuttle remained exactly where she had left it, ready to depart at a moment's notice. If negotiations failed, a soft chime announced a visitor, and Elena turned to find a Shalvek aide standing at the entrance to the room. The aide said that the High Archon requested a private meeting with the human ambassador. Elena agreed, and followed the aide through winding corridors to a secure meeting room. Deep inside the Citadel, the High Archon was waiting for her alone. Without his usual entourage of warriors and advisors, he looked older somehow. The pride that had radiated from him earlier, replaced by something that might have been exhaustion or perhaps the weight of difficult decisions. He gestured for Elena to sit, but she remained standing. He said that he had verified her claims about human agents in Shalvek space, said that his intelligence services had confirmed the presence of at least 3,000 operatives, with evidence suggesting many more remained undetected. He said that analysis of the weapons she had described suggested that humanity was indeed capable of causing significant damage to hegemony homeworlds, even through their planetary defense systems. Elena said nothing. Waiting for him to continue, the Archon said that he had served the hegemony for over 600 years. He said that he had led fleets against dozens of species, had conquered worlds beyond counting, had never known defeat in any form. He said that in all that time, no species had ever responded to a hegemony demand the way humanity had responded today. He asked if humans were truly insane, or if there was something he was missing. Elena considered the question carefully before answering. She said that humans were not insane, at least not in the way he meant. She said that humans simply had a different relationship with death and survival than most species in the galaxy. She said that most civilizations, when faced with overwhelming force, calculated the odds and chose the path that preserved the most lives. She said that humans calculated the odds the same way, but then they asked a different question. They asked what kind of lives they would be preserving by surrendering. They asked whether survival as slaves or subjects was worth the price of giving up their freedom. They asked whether their children would thank them for choosing safety over dignity. And when they asked those questions, the calculation changed. The Archon was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised Elena deeply. He said that he respected her, and that he respected her species. He said that the hegemony had grown complacent over the centuries, secure in their power and accustomed to easy victories. Said that humanity had reminded him of something important, that the galaxy was not tame, that danger still existed, that strength without wisdom was merely arrogance. He asked what terms humanity would accept to resolve this dispute peacefully. Elena said that her terms were simple. She said that the hegemony would withdraw all claims to human territory immediately and permanently. She said that there would be no compensation, no concessions, no face-saving gestures for the hegemony to present to their citizens. She said that in exchange, humanity would offer nothing except the promise that they would not be the ones to start a war. The Archon's scales rippled in what might have been frustration or perhaps grudging amusement. He asked if she understood that she was asking him to accept Humiliation before the entire galaxy. Elena said that she understood. Perfectly, she said that he had a choice. Accept embarrassment. Or accept destruction. She said that she knew which one she would choose in his position. The Archon was silent for a very long time. Finally, he rose from his seat and said that the hegemony would withdraw its claims. He said that this matter was concluded. He turned and walked out of the room without another word. And Elena watched him go with no expression on her face. The assembly reconvened 2 hours later, and the speaker announced that the territorial dispute between the hegemony of Shelvek and humanity had been resolved through diplomatic channels. The chamber was filled with murmurs of astonishment as delegates realized what had happened. The great hegemony, the most powerful military force in the sector, had backed down before a species that most of them had never even heard of until today. Elena stood on the central platform one last time and thanked the assembly for their patience. She said that humanity desired peace and friendship with all the species of the galaxy. She said that humanity was always willing to negotiate in good faith with any civilization that approached them with respect. But she also said that humanity would never again be threatened, would never again be pushed around, would never again accept demands from those who thought that power alone entitled them to take what they wanted. She said that the galaxy had learned an important lesson today, and she hoped that it would not need to be taught again. She walked off the platform and through the great doors of the assembly chamber. Without looking back, the corridors were crowded with delegates who stepped aside as she passed, watching her with expressions that ranged from fear to respect to something that might have been admiration. Near the docking bay, a young delegate from a species Elena did not recognize stepped into her path. The delegate was small, with delicate features and nervous eyes, and Elena could tell that their species had only recently achieved spaceflight. The young delegate asked if she could ask a question. Elena nodded. The delegate asked how humans could remain so calm when facing the possibility of their own destruction. Elena considered the question, thinking about all the wars and disasters and near-extinction events that had shaped her species over the millennia. She said that humans had always lived with the possibility of destruction. She said that from the moment humans had developed nuclear weapons, they had known that their civilization could end at any time. She said that before that, they had lived with plagues and famines and natural disasters that had killed millions. She said that humans had never known a time when they were truly safe, when destruction was not waiting just around the corner. She said that the rest of the galaxy was just now learning to live with that kind of uncertainty. But for humans, it was simply the way things had always been. The young delegate's eyes widened, and Elena could see that she was struggling to comprehend a species that had evolved under such conditions. Elena smiled, and for the first time since arriving at the Citadel, there was genuine warmth in that smile. She said that the galaxy was big enough for everyone, and that humanity had no desire to conquer or dominate other species. She said that all humanity wanted was to be left alone to chart their own course among the stars. But she also said that if anyone ever threatened that dream again, they would find that humanity was ready to defend it with everything they had. She wished the young delegate well and continued on her way to the docking bay. Her shuttle was waiting exactly where she had left it, and she boarded alone without any ceremony or fanfares. The shuttle lifted off and passed through the Citadel's docking field. Elena looked back at the massive station one last time. 4,000 species lived and worked within those walls. Civilizations that had existed for millions of years before humanity had even discovered fire. They had all just learned the same lesson. Humanity was not to be threatened, not to be intimidated, not to be pushed around, and above all, humanity was never, ever to be cornered. Elena turned away from the viewport and closed her eyes as her shuttle accelerated toward human space. The journey home would take 3 days, and she intended to sleep for most of it. She had earned the rest.